So let's continue with our health system inside Unity using Playmaker. And so now that we have a system in place to where we can launch a projectile, we can hit a bad guy, and we know that that collision is working, we can confirm that because when we launch our projectile, the object is getting destroyed. So as I launch this, I can confirm that everything's working because if you remember, if I go back into my prefabs and I select my cannonball, this cannonball is spawned. When it detects a collision, it passes it to a new state. The new state gets the collision info. It captures the game object tag, filters that based on whether it's an enemy or not, and later we'll add another decision tree here or another split, another event that we can pass this off if it hits other kinds of objects. But once it detects that it did in fact hit an enemy, it'll pass it on to this enemy hit, and it sends an event that says object hit and launches this new hit event. And then we pass it on to the state, which is destroy self. And so I'll just update this state now. So it updates to the destroy state. So I know that it is in fact detecting the collision. It is filtering it based on the enemy, because otherwise my projectile object would not be destroyed and it wouldn't disappear. So now I want to tie this into a system that subtracts from the enemy health and ultimately destroys the game object once its health reaches 0. So there's a couple different ways that we can do this. I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. So I'm going to go back to my bad guy object. And my bad guy object has a state machine that's already assigned to it. And if you remember, we have this idle state and we have an event. This new hit, this is the thing that gets triggered by our projectile from our tank. And we can filter this. We can create different kinds of events. So that new hit is launched by the projectile from the tank. So once that event is launched, we pass into a take damage state. And the take damage currently doesn't do anything. It just kind of passes over to this state. So now let's set up a simple health system here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my variables, and I'll create a simple float variable, and we'll call this enemy health. Okay, it is a float variable. It may be a little more efficient to do this as an integer. However, I like the idea of using a float value because once we start doing a heads-up display for our bad guy, we can start to scale things based on this value. So there's a couple of different things that we can do, and we may be multiplying by a floating point anyway. So you could do this as an integer or as a float, but this will keep me from having to convert it to a float a little bit later. But just know it's a little less efficient than doing an integer. So I'm going to set the initial value to 100. And we can tweak these values a little bit later to kind of balance things. But for now, we have 100. I'm going to reveal that in the inspector, and what that does is it gives me the ability to go up into the inspector when I have the bad guy selected and influence the value of that variable. So I'll go back to my state, and this is the place where I want to start to take damage from health. So when the bad guy is spawned, he has a current health of 100, and so if he's taking damage, we know he's already been hit. He's been hit by the cannonball, and so now we want to take damage. So we'll just do a simple math. Just that my screen recording software still has its control panel up, so I'm assuming I'm recording, but we'll find out pretty soon. So I'm going to jump back into math, and I want to do a float subtract. There we go, float subtract. I'll double click. So the float that I want to subtract from is the enemy health, and now I can determine what kind of damage this projectile should do. Now I'm going to, in very simple terms, I'm just going to hard code a value in here, but I could use a variable. I could also do some things that, depending on the speed or the velocity of the projectile hit, we could factor that in, because if you remember, if I go back into my prefabs, we're getting collision information in here, and one of the things that we're detecting in that collision is the relative velocity. So we could detect the velocity of that. So maybe that there's some kind of play at some point that depending on the velocity of the projectile based on energy that you're collecting or power-ups, you could influence the damage that we're doing. But at this point, we'll keep it very simple. I'll select my bad guy and I'll go back to my take damage state. So what I want to do for the sake of this demo is I'll just subtract 10 from the overall value of health. I want to do that just one time. I don't want to do this every frame. And I'll add a finish transition and pass that back to my idle state. So currently this is set up to where when that new hit gets fired, it sends the action over to the take damage state, and the take damage will subtract. So I should be able to hit this thing 10 times with my current setup before health is set to 0. Now, at this point, I could test this simply by looking at this machine that I've created. I'll stay focused on this state machine. And as I fire off these projectiles, I can see that it is in fact passing it to the take damage state and then passing it back to idle. So each time I hit that, I can see it firing. But I have no way, unless I put a heads-up display or pay attention to what the current value of health is. And you can see that by revealing that variable in the inspector, I can get some feedback and some real-time updates. So that's a pretty handy thing. Another reason why we want to expose that variable in the inspector. It's giving me an idea of what kind of health I have left. But during the gameplay, what I want to do is I want to start tracking whether or not this object receives enough damage to reduce its health to 0 or even make it less than 0. And so what I'll do is I'll just do a float compare, and that I can find, I believe, under logic, float compare, there we go. I'll just add that float compare to the idle state. So each time we enter the idle state, we'll compare our enemy health to a second value, which we'll set to 0. We can just leave the tolerance to 0. That's fine. And if it's equal to something, so if it's equal to 0, we want to be able to pass this off to a different state. And so I'll add another state, and I'll just call this this is the dead state. And I'll go back to events, and I'll just call this is dead. So now if I go back to the idle state, I'll add a transition, is dead, and I'll wire that transition to the dead state, and I'll go back to idle, and I'll focus on this float compare. So currently we'll take the enemy health, compare it to 0, and if it's equal to 0, we'll fire off the is dead event. Now, not only do we want it equal to 0, but we talked a little bit about the possibility of having variable health damage. Right now, we know that if we hit this thing 10 times based on the math that we have, we can eventually arrive at 0. But based on other weapons that we may create or other kinds of input, if the enemies are walking around and bouncing into things and taking some basic damage, or if they heal themselves with some kind of mechanism or earn some more armor or health along the way, we may lose the total value of our enemy health. And so what we want to do is we don't want to leave this set to just equal. We definitely want to, if health is equal to 0, we want to make sure it's dead. But if it's also less than 0, we want to send it off to dead as well. That way, if we do more damage than the enemy has, it'll still fire to this dead state. Now, this dead state, for now, what we'll do is we'll destroy the game object. So I believe if we go into game object, there it is, we'll destroy self. So we have a scenario set up here where this bad guy is sitting here and it's listening for a collision. And if it gets a collision, it's going to take some damage, or at least if the projectile detects collision with the enemy, it's going to fire off this new hit. So we'll take damage unless we get below 0 health, at which point the is dead will fire off and destroy this enemy. So let's give that a shot and see if this thing works. So my tank is driving around, sees a bad guy, and fires off a bunch of projectiles. And in fact, once we get to 0, the enemy dies. So we can dress that up a little bit with different animations and different effects, but that's the basic concept for destroying an enemy object, reducing its health. So a simple hit point system or a health system that gets reduced and destroys the game object. So the next thing that we'll do in the next presentation is talk about a little heads up display that lets us know what the health of the enemy object or the enemy is. so that we can track that, both for playtesting and then just getting a sense of what we're up against in terms of our enemies and what their health is. But we'll do that in the next presentation.